everyone on. Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us online today. So happy that you've taken the time to join this webinar, or this panel discussion, I should say. My name is Paul Thornton. I'm the Senior Commercialization Officer at the New Brunswick Innovation Foundation. I'm really excited to be hosting today's panel discussion. Before we get into the session, I do want to remind everyone participating that today's panel is really the first of a number of panels, webinars, and videos that we'll be hosting as part of our Growing Places series. From now until the end of May, we'll be producing some content, really highlighting some topics in commercialization. The NBIF is all about helping New Brunswick researchers take their ideas further. And this content is really intended to help researchers understand commercialization topics, help stimulate some discussion, and also it'll be a resource on our website going forward. So I'll just give a quick summary here of the schedule, really going from middle of April, which is today, right on through to the end of May, and then we'll have some additional topics coming up at the in the fall as well. So look forward to that. Ici c'est le programme en français aussi. So follow us on LinkedIn, and you'll stay up to date with videos that we're posting. You'll be able to register events and follow us for updates. So you'll notice today that we are hosting this simultaneously with translation in French. If you're just joining, you can select the French language channel at the bottom of the Zoom window. Vous pouvez sélectionner la chaîne française en bas de l'écran de Zoom. We will also be taking questions at the end of our discussion. At any time through the discussion, if you have a question, please enter it into the chat and send the chat to panelists. And we'll see it. I have one of my colleagues on the line, Brandon. He'll be able to help me moderate questions at the end of the session. So moving on to the session. Today's topic is, when is an innovation startup worthy? It's really a challenging question. And I think if you're a researcher, working in the lab, you've often maybe had a thought, maybe what you're working on could be potentially the basis for a company. But what does that really look like? And what are the features of a technology or team that need to be in place before you really start to consider going down the startup route? And it's really important to consider because starting a company is a huge undertaking. It's a lot of time and effort to create a company. So really, if you're going to commit to doing this, you want to do it well, and you want to commit, with an opportunity of having some success. So today I'm joined by three really terrific panelists. I want to give them each a couple of minutes to go ahead and introduce themselves, maybe tell us a little bit about what they do. And I have also a quick icebreaker question. And then after we do have, I guess the introductions are complete, we'll move on to the sort of the big questions of the panel. So maybe I'll get Chris to go ahead and go first. I'll let you introduce yourself. And I guess the icebreaker question is there something in your experience that you saw as being an unlikely technology that was commercialized, or something otherwise that surprised you about a technology that was successful?
Okay, I wasn't thinking of that kind of a question, but why don't I start by I'll start by introducing myself. Chris Mathis, very happy to be here today. Thanks to the NBIF team for having me. I'm an engineer, sometime investor, and a serial entrepreneur with a passion for early stage technology developments. And I've had some great experience covering the gambit from building up ideas to reaching a successful market. I'm the business lead for Viable Solutions, which is a division of Portfolio Solutions Group here in New Brunswick. And Viable is a strategic consultancy focused on helping the tech community build more successful companies and help the organizations that support those companies. I've got a few things on the go. I'm co-founder and board chair for 3D Planeta, and also executive chair for Stash Energy, both here in Fredericton. And I guess I've been pretty fortunate in my view to have had so much time in the tech industry, launching, building and mentoring tech startups and doing a lot of licensing of UMB technology to startups and to established industry. So happy to be here. Looking forward to the discussion.
Anything to contribute to the icebreaker?
The icebreaker. It's you know, one of the earlier things that I thought was actually pretty fascinating are stories like technology that was developed out of Wharf, Wisconsin, as an example. So the Wisconsin Applied Research, the product on the market was known as warfarin, is known as warfarin.
Okay.
But it's basically rat poison.
That's
Lydia,
a really,
Lydia could probably correct me a bit on that, but yeah. You know, like who knew, and what brought you to the point of testing in such a way, you know, that this was an opportunity. But you know, it's not necessarily a startup story, it's a licensing story, but at the end of the day, it was a very significant one, and Wisconsin has had a significant revenue base over the years. It is possible, in other words, for licenses to generate a decent revenue. So that's the first thing that came to my head. Not exactly the prettiest thing, but
no, that's great. Thank you, Chris. Lydia, I'll let you go ahead.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks for inviting me and join the panel. Really delighted to be here. I'm Lydia Marušić. I work at InnovaCorp, Nova Scotia's early stage venture capital organization. I'm responsible for life sciences, anything under the umbrella of human health. So my job is to find opportunities to invest, do due diligence, and once we are invested, to manage the portfolio, which means that I'm joining boards of these startups most of the time as a director or as an observer, actively participating in their activities that are commercialization, development, and hopefully successful exit. Prior to InnovaCorp, I worked for a large venture capital fund based in Toronto. I was here in the Atlantic Canadian office. And prior to that, I was in academia. So I was trained as a molecular biologist. I also have a background in medicine. And my last project there was a postdoctoral research in cancer, which was done in collaboration with a company, a US company that was developing a new therapeutic approaches to cancer treatment. So that kind of led me into this new path that I started almost more than 20 years ago. Quickly, in InnovaCorp, people are mostly familiar, I believe. We find, fund, and foster innovative Nova Scotia startups that start to create that want to change the world. And we focus on life sciences, clean tech, ocean tech, and information technology. We also have incubation facilities and a number of programs, one of which is the early stage commercialization fund that we collaborate with NBIF, and we're really happy to see it introduced in New Brunswick as well. Yeah. So for the icebreaker, I'd say blue cheese.
Okay.
I think blue cheese, although we don't really know who and how they invented it, I think it goes back to ancient Romans. Mm-hmm. We know it was probably a mistake in cheese making, and somebody was brave enough to taste it and found it worked.
Someone had to be that guy and taste it.
And I love blue cheese, but it's just that you're thinking about these elements of innovation and creativity and discovery. There is always some sort of serendipity involved, but you have to be really kind of have this ability to observe, and they have this curiosity and some way the courage to move it forward. And I think we also know another mold that is famous, which is penicillin for the treatment of infectious diseases. And that also had that element of serendipity in its discovery that really transformed the way we treat infectious diseases. So that's my icebreaker.
Oh, thank you, Lydia. Yeah, you can't look down on mold. It's given us a lot.
Yeah.
Okay, Philippe, your turn.
Thank you, Paul, NBIF, for inviting me to this panel, and I'm honored to feel like I have something to contribute. I'm primarily, my day job is I'm a research professor at UNB, but a lot of the things I do are innovative, and my students oftentimes pick up the baton and carry with that. My background is commercializing things out of academia in many ways. So I started my life right out of grad school, and the things I was working on actually had some market value, and I was able to take my grad work and self-fund starting a company. So that's one of the models that we'll probably end up talking about. And then I got involved with different forms of commercializing that and application development. But I ended up doing pretty much what I do now. I was writing a lot of proposals. I was trying to get the right people and writing a lot of reports, except I was at the bottom of the triangle of responsibility when you're a small business owner. Flip it around, come to university, it's much better where you're sort of at the apex and everyone's supporting you, trying to get your work out there. And Chris was a great mentor for that as well, for when I was here. Sorry, when he was here while I was starting out. And so now a lot of the work I do is in materials research. Initially, it was under sort of the clean tech umbrella, making energy, storing energy, transporting energy, whether it's electricity or heat, those kinds of things. I'm sort of shifting kind of into biomaterials now. So we're doing some COVID research and exploring other avenues in that area. So, but it's all premised on the work I've done. So it's not like a complete switch. It's building on the materials research, but what we know works for, say, pathogens and things. And so that's my background. I've been kind of involved in many different forms where we've tried to commercialize our own innovations, where we worked with others to help them commercialize their projects using our resources. I think my love, though, is championing ideas and getting ideas out there and letting others run with it. So I've done getting the gray hairs, trying to get revenue, justify investment, but then at the beginning of that is generating ideas and where they can go. I think I seem to enjoy that more. So that's kind of my space. As far as an icebreaker, I can think of probably 4 or 5 things that either they surprised me that they became revenue, and I think of things like pet rocks. There was never a need for a pet rock, and yet he made $50 million in the first year. I don't know if you remember that, Lydia. It was a huge innovation here back in the 70s, so maybe I'm dating myself.
It's like selling sand in the desert, right?
The outproduct of things like social media led to the innovation of selfie sticks. Never existed before. I saw a picture of someone using a selfie stick of them taking a picture of something. So it was, and apparently it's a $6 billion industry now. Yeah. And that to me was, when I first saw those coming from primarily Europe and Asia, I was, that's ridiculous. And now, they're a huge business. But in terms of actually what I think is innovative and has been a huge contribution, I think back to the discovery of the microwave oven. And something we take for granted now. It's a staple in the kitchen. In fact, even the new induction ranges are kind of based on the same principle of inductive heating. But the inventor of that at that time is actually from Maine, next door, working in wireless communication. He was at sort of the forefront, working in Raytheon, and they were doing all the radar, wireless detection during World War II. And while he was working on all his designs, he was kind of like working in the microwaves, and he kept noticing the chocolate bar in his pocket was melting. And kind of tried different experiments, and eventually he said, well, I should put this in a box and let the microwaves do their thing. And so as an employee of Raytheon, they had dozens of patents on that. And they said, no, our forte is in military communications, and we're going to let that go to other people. So you had Sharp and all these. And so that was a licensing phenomenon. That's a multi-$100 billion industry now. So those are the kinds of things that we at the time, it's like, oh, it's an interesting observation. I think Lydia was saying, you have observations, then what can you do with that? And there's some big leaps you take, some big improvements. That first microwave weighed 750 pounds, 6 feet tall. Now we have things that we almost throw them away, $50.
Yeah.
So there's all those innovations along the way. So that was my icebreaker contribution.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, so now I want to move into our questions for the panel. And really, if you're, considering the perspective of the researcher, the innovator, it's one thing for them to be working in the lab. Oftentimes they'll want to know, what are the technical aspects of an innovation or a technology that make it suitable for development into a startup, and really how can you assess that? So I'm thinking things like technology readiness level. I'm thinking things like the scalability, the potential scope of the technology, anticipated cost, IP position. How can we kind of get to grips with those things if you're a researcher, and what sort of things do you look for when assessing a technology and thinking, hey, it could be a startup? Chris, maybe we'll actually start.
Oh, I'm getting the first out of the gate on these. Okay,
that's right.
Fine. Well, I mean, my perspective has always been to start at the very first principles as to what got you to this point where the discovery was had in the first place. Like, what drove you to do this work? And quite often it informs you a lot as to, was it a particular kind of problem, or was it essentially some form of accident, not unlike some of the examples that we brought up today. And that is just important as a starting point, right? To look at the technology from that perspective. And the other thing I look for very early on is there any immediate evident aspects of the discovery or invention that are clearly going to be able to be applicable across more than one industry domain. There was a time when people used to roll their eyes about referring to platform technologies, but let's be clear, especially if we're talking today about academic research, it generally, if there's a significant discovery, it is likely applicable across a number of different things. That inherently does make these as let's call a higher value, higher quality potential, and very platform based. So then you have a couple of interesting challenges, because the reason the researcher went down a particular path based on their interest or something that was inspirational and created that discovery doesn't mean that that's the first thing that actually is going to be the best thing to continue to move forward and commercialize. And so there's some rigor, there's some discipline that needs to kick in to do some searching. I see Catherine's on the list of folks here today. God bless
Catherine
her.
Vardy,
yes,
from CIPO.
Catherine Vardy. So, like, the key piece there is to do some investigation. It actually, Philippe could argue that this is actually an inherent part of how you can draw on your students anyway. Call it literature search, aka, and let's go further into patent searching. But there's so much information to gather up early on that helps reduce to practice a particular direction. And in that process, then it's about, well, what are you able to actually demonstrate today? What's the easiest thing to then demonstrate? Is it cheapest? Is it the fastest? Is it the most obvious? You need something that's going to trigger in others oh, that's cool, but just be expecting that it might be, that's cool, but I could really use it over here. Something completely different than what you thought.
Yeah.
And there shouldn't be anything wrong with that, right? But sometimes it's hard for people to even start there. So you'll hear from me probably in the course of a number of questions, some filter points, which end up being exits off a path, or potentially off a path towards a startup. It doesn't mean there isn't a life after that path, but I'm just offering that part of it is where it comes from, what kind of ideas you can at least at an early stage demonstrate that gives a sense of yes and or no, but
Yeah.
this idea could go in a couple of different ways.
That's a really interesting thing too, because I think that I've been familiar with the idea of the platform technology as well, because even once the technology gets, startup gets going, sometimes, your assumptions about a market are incorrect, right? And you're forced to pivot,
Yes.
and if you don't have a room to pivot and, address a different market or a different application, that kind of ends the startup's kind of pathway potentially. And that's a challenge.
It could sometimes, in our region, it's harder sometimes for people to feel the confidence of proceeding into a hardware derived solution. And yet, like if you look at the panel, I'm a hardware geek through and through. Philippe, certainly from a materials perspective, I would argue is highly hardware oriented. And from a medical perspective, an awful lot of things are hardware oriented. And so I think it's an interesting, when you think about the panelists today, because hardware is very tough, especially in a country where we're primarily service oriented, a service oriented group. And so the cost of scale becomes a clear factor and a challenge. And so you have to be very, very disciplined as to what are, and clear on what your goals are. As you want to head towards a startup, okay, here's a bunch of things that you need to look at, which we'll talk about today. But at the end of the day, what's your goal? What are you trying to achieve through that startup?
Lydia, do you have some thoughts to add, I guess, about, what are some key technical aspects of an innovation?
I just look at the technology. Let's forget about, what's the best way to commercialize it. I'll just say, okay, we speak with a researcher and they think they have something interested with that has commercial potential. I think that the first step for me is to assess the strength of that technology, the work that has been done. And lots of it goes to how unique it is, how protectable it is. And, and uniqueness goes to, like, if there is competition, do you have potential to do it better? Or do you have potential to open new markets even because nobody has done it this way before? So we are really talking about potential, and we're talking about that foundational intellectual property, because that's going to be the cornerstone or whatever, wherever this technology goes, if it's a licensing deal or a startup, that the IP is really the key here. And so it's really important. So we think about, let's say, the research has been done and there is a manuscript in preparation. That's probably a good time to think about protecting your IP, because then you understand the scope of discovery.
Yeah.
And then, so once you have that paper that once you apply for your IP protection, then you can publish it, which is also important in terms of your commercialization path, because that has been reviewed by your peers and it's been validated.
Yeah.
And so this is how you start. It's a lot. So I don't have a lot of I'd say requirements of a researcher at this stage. I really, really focus on the technology, because I think if the technology is really unique, no matter, it's going to be a rough ride and a roller coaster ride, but if that foundational technology is unique. And Chris, we shouldn't be afraid of using platforms, because it really, especially for the startup, it has to be a technology that's broader than just one single product, or something that provides just incremental improvement of what is already out there. So I think that's how you start with your foundations. And I think that market assessment is probably the first step as researcher ventures into commercialization and says, okay, I think you have something. Who is going to use it? How are you going to sell it? So you understand that you're developing something that's not just in the lab, it's not a research, it's going to be a product. and what that product's going to look like and who is going to use it and how they're going to use it, what's the market risk. So that all can be done even before you venture and start sort of raising money or deciding whatever the path you're going to take.
Yeah.
So that's my kind of approach to it.
That's really, really good points. I think that's something we're going to be looking at later on in our series is assessing a market, how actually to look at that. Philippe, do you have some input, I guess, on technical aspects of an innovation that make it suitable for a startup?
Well, I think I'll probably reference how I approach things. I think oftentimes, you mentioned, for example, Chris did about literature review. I do include patents and things as part of that because that can be much richer in terms of what people think is their knowledge. Not because you're worried about what is my knowledge, but rather it adds to your development of what is special, what is your special sauce. So I think the background work, getting that put together so that one, you can appreciate whose shoulders you're standing on. Two, what you're seeing in the future as being that innovation or that invention, because in my case, I'm often writing a proposal or I'm trying to defend someone else's work, or someone's come to me to say, can we do this project together? And I need some guidance on IP. So understanding that background, where you fit in terms of technology. So all the terms we kind of hearing, is this incremental? Is this disruptive platform? Is it adaptive, or these technologies? That's okay. All of those are, valuable innovations that can be revenue, but where do we start in order to defend that IP, to say this is the intellectual property? And sometimes it's just a small tweak, or you're bringing something from a different angle, or building on your own expertise. So I think that's sort of the first step, is understanding where you're coming from in terms of the innovation, where you're contributing. And luckily, we're kind of developing a common language now in technology development transfer, this idea of a TRL. That's something that's in the last 20 years or so, 15, 20 years, about where do you fit in? Where do you think your technology fits in with your space in getting out the door? So, if you're a 1 or 2, you're at the really inception, embryonic stage of an idea. If you're at 3 or 4, you've done some lab work, you've done some of those development. Or if you're ready to partner up, you're at 7, 8, you're kind of ready to partner with someone. So I think that's the first part. And then the second part is, once you kind of have your brackets around what you're doing, is understand where it fits within the value chain, if you want to call it that. So, I'm doing a project, I'm talking about solar cells. We don't make solar cells here. We're making the ingredients at the very, very early stage. I said, we're going to make the raw materials that go into the solar cells, in a greater scale, at a cheaper rate or higher purity. And that's where we fit in. So we don't make the solar cells or the final product, but we need to be talking to those final end people in order to say, will you please buy my stuff?
Yeah, that's a really good point.
So other times, if you're disruptive, you are the end player, you are the end developer, and you're saying, I need to get this out there and I don't know who to partner with. Yeah. So understand where you fit in there. And sometimes you could be at the very beginning of an established chain or new contribution, or if you're making something disruptive that's really not been out there, you have to find either the people who are going to help you, or you're going to have to create it yourself. And creating it yourself, as Chris was saying, being a hardware manufacturer in some areas is harder than others. If you're in India, you could probably get a whole plant going, or in China, a whole plant going overnight. Here, it's a little bit harder because you don't have the infrastructure. So that's part of your decision making about, do I do it myself? Do I work with people? Do I look for the big partner and somehow entice them? But you want to be doing that all early on as part of that homework. Yeah. Again, it's all that background work. Who are the people in this space? Who would be my potential investor? And the proposals that I've worked on that have been more successful have been at least identifying where I'm in the chain and who that end partner is and what that space is. I don't talk about markets because at this stage, if you're doing an inception project, you can talk about where they fit in, but people always like to say, this is a, you know, selfie sticks. It's a $25 billion market, and I'm going to make carbon fiber nano sticks with carbon nanotubes or something like that. You know, what's the, you know, I don't know what that number is sometimes, but at least you're aware who would be the buyer.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. You know, sometimes it's really early to know what your market maybe is specifically, but at the same time, it's important to think in general who would be the buyer, and that kind of is a bit of a segue into my next question, and this is something around, I think, a topic that we see a lot in early commercialization efforts is getting a validation from the customer around, is an innovation meeting a need? Is it really doing something that the customer wants it to or needs it to do? How can you actually validate that value proposition, I guess, with the customers?
Mm-hmm.
And I'll maybe move on to Lydia, I guess, with that question. What do you think, Lydia? What are some ways that if you're an innovator that you can reach out and find those people who are potentially your customers and talk to them and find out, is this worth pursuing?
Yeah, I think the earlier you engage your customer or user, the better it is. It's not that difficult. People do it all the time. You reach out to it's called the primary market research. And I think as you develop your product, the more input you have from your user, the better it is. So you're not developing something in isolation and then say, okay, this is the best thing, and now use it. You are constantly refining that product or your prototype. Let's say we're developing a prototype with that user feedback, and that allows you to really move forward in a sort of a smart way, where you will avoid a lot of problems down the road where you have to go back and redesign the product because you haven't thought about certain things. And there, I think I'm talking mostly from the point of view of developing medical devices when we're, so it's going to be, you know, your clinicians usually who is going to use that product. You usually engage with some clinicians who are opinion leaders. We call them KOLs, key opinion leaders in the community, the ones who will hopefully use your product when they're doing research. This is part of their research envelope, and then they will publish using your prototype, and then they will talk about it at conferences. And this is how you get sort of known, and how you get sort of that trust that what you are developing really has an audience, and it's a valuable tool for clinicians, because then from those key opinion leaders, other clinicians in that field would continue to adopt the product. But the one thing is, so it's that constant, that feedback loop is really important, and the understanding. So now we are already doing how much of that you can really do in the academic environment, and maybe that's another question. But I just say there is a limit what you can do in your lab for different reasons, and one of those is also the discipline and the structure that you have to put around moving from developing a research prototype towards developing actually a product that's going to be used by your client. So maybe we talk about it later, but I think that's so the message is, the earlier you can, the better it is to involve your user in your design.
Okay, that's a really good point. I think that you highlighted that feedback loop, and I think that you're right. That's absolutely so important, that you're not trying to invent something based on assumptions and in a vacuum. Philippe, what do you have some thoughts around that? Around finding, as you're a researcher yourself, right? So you have a unique, I think, a perspective that's pretty relevant for the people who are on the line today. You know, how to find the customers.
Right. I think the challenge is, no matter how much we think we've invented sliced bread again, that, you know, oh, this is so great, this is so awesome, I have this great, and it's going to take off. I think getting that feedback, as Lydia was saying, from other perspectives, other viewpoints, and I think that's the greatest value, is to get other people, you know, their viewpoints, etc. So if everyone gets excited, you know, if you've talked to the end user perhaps, and so they've run it up their food chain, and now the president of that company wants to talk to you, or at least you have a technology champion within an organization that's an end user. But then you have people regionally that are that tested you and said, well, what really are you doing? What does it actually cost? What is it the value? Because sometimes having that feedback early on, other inputs besides your own personal input, can moderate your true appreciation of the technology. So I've been in that space where I've got excited and it's like, yeah, I don't think I can do that in the end. It's like, I'll still do the work. I mean, I'm still excited by the work. It might lead to somewhere. And I can think of a company I helped where it's like, yeah, making pressure sensors doesn't really excite me. But now, now they're working in pharma packaging and beer bottles and wine bottles, making smart skin products. So, pressure sensors I thought were around, it's an interesting area, but, we were able to get other people excited. Their feedback came in and they really helped to kind of, look at those opportunities. So I think the more feedback you get, it works both ways. Yeah. Things that you might be excited by may be tempered, but other things that you're working on, other people can pick up and see the value that your perspective did not even appreciate. So, making a pressure sensor for a smartphone was what we thought was the initial application, or prosthetics. And it turned out after some time developing that they were to branch out and generate revenue in a whole different space, which I think was mentioned earlier about being able to adapt. So I think having not only the homework being done, but also having the input from other people outside your own sphere, that feedback that Lydia was mentioning, I think is crucial to crossing over to what those end users are as well.
I want to move on to Chris, just with your input on this.
Listen, I feel like I have so many scars related to ensuring as early as possible that we get the voice of the customer influencing our direction. And so I'm 100% backing the discussion here. There's things like the utility, the perceived utility versus what the customer is truly interested in, but also cost leads to a sense of what your scalability is, especially with a number of physical products. I remember one technology at UNB, it had tremendous performance for what it did, but one of the things that it required was platinum. So at a research level, Philippe could tell me probably exactly what he pays for platinum. That's not exactly going to be useful when you're trying to make, 1,000 tons a day or whatever, right? Yeah. So the scalability is a component that is, as well as the utility, are inherently folded into your constant iteration and engagement with customer, and obviously also identifying who is the customer. There's the customer that you want to engage with depending on the level and the type of technology you have, and there's the end user as well. You need to keep those things in mind. So anyway, 100% support that.
That's a really good point, Chris. I think that I think Philippe mentioned the concept of a technology champion in a partner or in a different industry, someone who kind of can help you maybe find those customers. I think that's something really important to leverage. We're just kind of moving. Go ahead, Chris.
I'll just add one thing, Paul, is that what is it that you think you're replacing? If the benefit of what you're bringing or thinking that you're bringing to the market is only, say, a 5 or 10% improvement, it's not necessarily enough, depending on the market, to have a substantial enough impact that anybody's going to shift what they do today. Even if it's better, it could be cleaning, it could be a green technology, but it has to have substantive enough differences in performance, improvement, cost, all those things, before it's necessarily going to be adopted by market X, Y, Z.
Yeah, all good points. So we have about 20 minutes left, and I do want to take some time, last maybe 10 minutes of the session for some questions. If you do have a question and you're watching our talk today, please enter that into the chat, and we will be sure to see it. I think our final question one I had was, I've always pretty interested in the human aspect of commercialization. You know, an innovation, you know, getting a startup going from an innovation requires having a team. You know, you need to have you know, strong management, someone who's accountable to actually lead an effort. Who in your experience is you know, the best suited to kind of lead that effort, and you know, how can you recruit the people that you need to be on the team, and maybe how do you find outside help? I think that's an interesting question to me. I don't know who would like to kind of start off on that.
I can start, and I'll probably add later as there's
more. Sure, maybe just quick. Maybe we're just going to try and do it a couple more minutes, per answer.
I think starting off, you know, even to do all that preparation and everything, I think part of the people you want around you are, and it's maybe a little bit easier in academia because there's a lot of talent in the academic world, but you can have talented people, but you also have to have the work ethic in there as well. So just simply saying, I have a great idea, and you work on it 2 hours a day, you're probably only going to go a certain distance. So the people I look for to work with that are going to be great drivers of opportunities are you know, both the talented, but you don't have to be the sharpest tool in the shed to persevere and to be motivated. So in a way, grad school is a great filter. People I can see who have those innate skills that could be not necessarily just innovators, but help move some technology forward. So there's an advantage there, but I think that's what you should all be looking within your own sphere or people around you. So I know oftentimes we take technologies and we say, how do we fund that? And we automatically outreach to venture capitalists or, you know, or either private funding raises. They are part of that equation of input, but oftentimes what's going to move that forward is not just the money, it's the people who can work for nothing for 6 months, you know, initially, or very low amount on small funds. So I think the work ethic and being as excited as the innovator will help move that forward. So, because in the end, there's only 28 hours in a day, so we try our best. So.
Bootstrapping's a tough thing for sure. Chris, how about you? What in your experience are the best places to kind of start building a team?
Well, the first thing is diversity as quickly as possible, because wherever you started as an inventor or a team of let's say students and academia combined, those aren't all the same skills that will be transferable for a successful startup. In some cases that's going to work out decently well, but it's pretty rare. And what we don't necessarily have time today is the variations on a theme of how you can commercialize. Perhaps maybe there's some questions around that, but the key issue I think is, if you even think about the last question and how important engaging a customer is, a lot of folks from a technical perspective are not necessarily capable or comfortable to engage strangers, complete strangers, make cold calls, whatever it takes in order to get that sense early on as to whether this is a tangible idea that's worth pursuing, right? That's one example. The other is that all of the founder, inventors, contributors to the tech, it doesn't mean that they all have the skills to be involved in the company. You can't take away from them, nor should you, that they were the inventor of something or the founder of a company. But the growing of that company requires a number of different skills that may not be inherent in that original founding team. And we shouldn't put the pressure on them to be associating their time and their efforts towards something that's outside of what they're able to develop. Unless you have tons of money and so they have lots of time to make lots of mistakes, right? Which sometimes is possible. But anyway, the point is there's a lot of different skills needed. They're not all necessarily coming from that same source of people that created the idea.
Yeah.
Exceptions include some certain panelists, and as far as I'm concerned, because he's taken things, he's more of an applied person, and so already he's engaging and thinking differently than perhaps some other academics. hat tip to Philippe there.
This is the thing too. It's not something that you're taught, I guess, going through in your academic training. You know, how to engage with different people and how to engage
I would
with
echo
people in
what
businesses.
I would echo with what Chris said about bringing in diversity, and I think that's part of that earlier comment about bringing other people from different perspectives. And it's a challenge because sometimes you would love to have financial experts, people that can really talk about cost and things like that, because those numbers are not always available from an academic perspective. So I think the more diversity, it brings in their networks. So it's not just about your academic network or your buyer network, but a larger network. So the bigger the network, the more opportunities, the more curves you could address, or other opportunities.
Great. Lydia, what are your thoughts on building a team around an innovation? Certainly, no, it's a big part of evaluating a startup is how strong is the team. So,
well, I think even before that startup is formed, it's important for researchers to understand the difference between doing research and doing product development. It's huge. It's like here you're operating in an environment with a very flexible timelines. You can take, you know, some detours and work on very interesting questions. And once you move into a product development, you're on a very tight timeline in a very, very structured approach how to do it. And it's just like you are, if it's a startup, then you're essentially having money to get to that next significant milestone that will allow you to raise more money, and so it goes until you actually get your product to market, which for medical technology can take years and a lot of capital that you need capital to operate without bringing any revenues. So it's a very, very difficult path. And so people have to understand that. They also have to understand that they're having developed a product that is going to work every time in any circumstances. It's going to be cost effective. That's going to be used by built not by engineers, but somebody on the manufacturing floor. It's going to be used by clinicians who cannot tweak, things to make it work better. So all that is a very kind of a big learning for entrepreneurs. So some founders, are ready to make the jump. Some researchers are ready to make the jump. They are more entrepreneurial oriented, or their students are. And it's great when their students are like that, or the postdocs, because then they can take the lead. Oftentimes researchers are not willing to leave their academic jobs to do it, but I think it's really essential that they're involved in some capacity in the beginning. Yeah. The one other thing you went with a team, the team has to understand that that initial team is not going to be the team that's going to take the product to market. So their flexibility and understanding that as the product development continues towards the market approval, different sets of skills are needed. And finally, if you're going to market, that's totally a different story. So you're looking for that flexibility and understanding in the founder that they know when's the time for them to step down and let somebody else come in and take it a step further. And I think that's the question of the title of this talk is when it's something, a licensed opportunity or a startup. I think that's the key juncture there when the team around the discovery has to understand, are they willing to do all that, or if they're not willing to do it, or just feel don't have skills to do it, then likely it's better to go on the licensing route. Although, risk with that is that your partner, your licensing partner, is not going to try so hard enough as your startup to get the product to market. They may say, okay, it's not working, shelve it. So it's there are risks everywhere, but yeah, I think that's really important for the founding team, for the researchers to have a good understanding, to talk to people, to understand what they are up to. Yeah. And I think for us initially, everybody talks about there is lack of of skilled people to commercialize technologies. It's everywhere. If you go to Toronto, they say there is lack of people. Even in Boston, there is lack of people. There is such a big competition for good people. So we have to be able to develop the teams. The teams, we have to groom the people who are willing to take the risk, who are willing to learn, and get them some good mentors. And I don't think that's difficult, and has worked in my experience a number of times. So I wouldn't be discouraged. And even if someone says, "Oh, I've never done it," but if they're interested, they can learn.
Yes.
And so, yeah.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of resources to help people learn, and I think it's just sort of finding the people who are willing and have the time and not averse to being on the team and being involved with some of the risk and time that's involved with that. We just have around just a little under 10 minutes left to go in the hour, so I wanted to bring in a couple of questions from the participants. I think the first question here, I'm just going to put it out to the group, are what are your thoughts on how to bring innovations to market that are counterintuitive or perhaps against current industry best practices? I think that maybe talking a little bit about disruptive technologies. What are your thoughts on that? Maybe I can open the floor.
Well, I guess I can maybe a quick comment. I guess when you say disruptive, I guess is you always want to do your little SWOT analysis, right? Your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So that's when you're evaluating your IP. But the opposite goes to who are you disrupting? If it's Merck or DuPont, if you're going to disrupt them by thinking you're going to come up with the secret sauce, a better way to slice bread. You will have to be part of that assessment, and you would be very valuable to get other viewpoints and other perspectives if it's disruptive. So who are you disrupting? And I'm thinking back to a project we had done for tire research, and Chris mentioned this. We actually came up with formulations for tires that were demonstrated that gave you 10% better gas mileage, and you didn't have to change anything else in your tire, not designs, everything. It was disruptive. And Goodyear and Michelin said, no, it wasn't worth the extra 10 cents a pound for that disruptive technology. And yet we've been promoting green, better gas mileage, lower CO2 emissions et cetera. So it was not justifiable because it was, I don't say disruptive because it's adaptive, but so knowing what you're disrupting and how big that disruption is, maybe I'm misunderstanding the question, but that would be part of my analysis, I think.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Chris or Lydia, any thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I guess I'm happy to. I can't think of too many technologies that I've really dug deep into that weren't disruptive in terms of the traditional markets being completely taken aback by the new thing being offered and tested. It's a massive undertaking. You have to find the alignment of a host of things depending on the industry. For instance, work that we did early on in drug powder manufacturing with Mathis Instruments. The FDA had created a special safe harbor to encourage companies to try to improve their quality control around powder blending, because the label claim on a drug was not actually being achieved. But because they had driven such a culture of quality assurance, but without the actual things being quality tested, the whole nature of that was so hard for the industry to shift. And so coming in with a solution that could provide you that real-time sense of efficacy by looking at blend uniformity in that case was a huge thing. So you need to find that combination where you're going to have to be prepared to do a ton of education. You need key influencers in play, influencers within the industry, as well as influence from the point of view of what it is you're offering. The kind of margin and performance gap has to be huge in order for people to even give you a serious consideration. And then at the end of the day, you may have to have a different kind of way of bringing it to the market even than the traditional products that you've disrupted in the process. sometimes not. And so the channel that you develop can be varying tremendously as well. Anyway, lots to there. That's a good single malt conversation sometime.
For sure, I'll put it on the list.
Yeah, I think most of the really new developments in the history of humankind were disruptive, and these are like the brave people who took that first step. And oftentimes, you know, there were some technologies that were too early for their time, and they got adopted later. So, you know, and I think that's why venture capital exists, because they're going to take the risk with something totally new and see if it works. And I think I would say if there is something that somehow really opens that new market, new way of doing things that is different, I mean, I would look at it, and I'd be interested to dig deeper into it and see if that to take the risk with it.
Yeah.
So I would just say, just give it a try.
Give it a try. Okay, one more question, I think, from the audience. So we're going to see if someone can maybe chime in quickly. We have someone who's asked if you're a student, say you're even an international student, you have ideas to kind of implement technology. How can you acquire funds or seek some funding to recruit people and work on our technology? I have an answer to that, but I can let the panel kind of chime in first.
Well, I applaud the student for being innovative. That's usually a challenge because you don't often have all the tools and resources to test these things. So the easiest thing is to find a professor you can or someone you can work with that has the resources aligned with your technology space. Now, in the university, there's rules about intellectual property, and so if the student was the originator of that, there's rules that are followed in developing IP. But if in demonstrating that there was a lot introduced by the professor or even other students, that is usually captured in internal disclosures we do with the university. So we didn't talk at all about intellectual property so much, but so they should realize, and I think this is the challenge oftentimes, that when people have an idea, they think they own it 100% from beginning to end. And I think certainly professors feel that way, that if I develop something, I own it all the way to the final product 20 years from now. And there's so many contributors, so many team members that make something work, a product going out, that it's great to have an idea. If you can get your position with that professor funded with NBIF or other environments or other systems, or perhaps professor has some discretionary funds, that would probably be the first approach, unless you have access to resources already on your own that you can say, I'm going to pay for this, or I'm going to start my own company and partner with someone. But there's a lot of barriers to just being an idea company. You have to have some history, et cetera. So but that might be the first level, and recognizing that you are bringing in a project. Yeah, but it's a project.
It ties in with my my answer that I was going to give, is that find a mentor or a researcher that can help guide you, and then come talk to us at the NBIF, because we have programs that are sort of aimed at specifically at commercialization and supporting those people to actually do that work. So we have the Lab to Market program, we have the Early Stage Commercialization Fund, which is we've just completed its first round. So these are all things that students can be involved in, but they need to engage their supervisors and have the supervisors be.
Of course, and there's Breakthrough.
Yeah. And Breakthrough as well. Yeah, I should not forget about that. So we have kind of come to the top of our hour. I want to thank all of our panelists really for being joining us for this discussion. I think it's been really illuminating for me. I hope for everyone who has been on the call as well. I think some of the big takeaways for me are really kind of understanding the strength of technology as being a critical thing, being able to have a technology that's broad enough in scope that you can pivot when you need to, and that is a good feature of a technology for a startup. I think really good points were made around customer discovery and engaging the customer early on in that sort of iterative loop and cycle of improving your technology to make it worthy of the effort of creating a startup. And I say thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. I think that we really enjoyed your perspectives, and hope we can probably do this again sometime in the near future.
And I might add, if anyone has other questions outside this time limit we have, you can contact us directly, at least me directly. I don't know, Chris.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, same here.
if there's something that comes up that you wish you had asked or wasn't asked, then certainly feel free to outreach.
That's great. Thank you so much, and please be sure to follow us on the NBIF LinkedIn site and the LinkedIn page for all the coming events in the Going Places series. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.